the lands that the lands that I live and work on. So I live on Camaragal land in the northern beaches of Sydney. I work on the land of the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation. That's where I am. That's where I am today. I'm in my office at work. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I extend my respect to any First Nations people here today. And given the topic, I want to be very clear that we are meeting on stolen, unceded, colonised land. And of course that Australia was built on genocide. And I've started to say that in these presentations because of the policing around the word genocide that is a feature of the last couple of years, and the policing of languaging around Palestine and Israel. You know, I'm a beneficiary of the genocide that took place in Australia. And it was interesting for me to read this paper by the very well-known Palestinian scholar Edward Said, a paper called Zionism from the Perspective of Its Victims. And in that paper, as well as noting the you know, the unbalanced way in which Palestine was partitioned back in the 40s, he suggests there's only one parallel in recent colonial history to the colonisation of Palestine, and that is the conquest of Tasmania. So, you know, there's a shared history here that I want to acknowledge in this paper. So I'm going to talk about some data that I have been working on. I've been working on it for a few years. It took quite a while to get this data set together. So I feel I'm just at the start of really trying to understand some of the language patterns and even trying to work out what some of the linguistic questions should be around this data. And I look forward to some discussion with you today about that. Now, the project comes out of an interdisciplinary interest. So on my slide there, you can see some of the people that I've been working with in international law, including international human rights law. So Emily Crawford and Jackie Mowbray, who are at the law school at Sydney University. Associate Professor Amanda Alexander, who's at the Catholic University here in Sydney, also a specialist in international humanitarian law. Brian Cuddy, who's a historian here at Macquarie University. Matt Killingsworth in international relations at the University of Tasmania. Associate Professor Victor Catan in public international law at the University of Nottingham. And my colleague and former PhD student, Alex Garcia, who's here today. So she's the other linguist on the project. And the data is rich and deep, and this is why all of these perspectives need to find a way to come together. And we're still trying to work out, you know, interdisciplinary work is hard to do, and we're still sort of finding our way towards questions that really come from an interdisciplinary point of view. Okay, so 3 steps for the paper today. I want to say a little bit about the context of the data, and that could go on for a really long time. So I just want to say a few things about the context of the data. I want to make a brief statement on the methods that linguistics is bringing to this project. And then I want to give you some preliminary findings about the construction of people and place in this new corpus called the Palestine-Israel UN Resolutions Corpus. Okay, so a little bit about the context. Now, I've been trying to read my way around this field out of linguistics, trying to read in international law, reading in history, reading in the sociology of war and violence, to try and get a handle on the broader cultural context that sits behind any of these UN resolutions that Alex and I are bringing linguistic expertise to. A really important book was published in 2023 by Adi Imsais, who's Professor of International Law at Queen's University in Canada. Actually born in Gaza, grew up in Gaza. And he's published the first monograph treatment of the relationship of the United Nations to what's referred to as the question of Palestine. And he makes an argument about the way in which the UN has essentially constructed a state of what he calls legal subalternity for Palestine and Palestinians. Some of you may recognise that term from Gramsci. And so the overall argument is, within the framework of international law, the state of Palestine and of Palestinians has been precarious, contingent, and they have been operated on by the infrastructure of international law, but not afforded their legal rights under that law. And it's a really brilliant book. And so just to say a couple of things that come out of reading this book. So he's actually got a quote from a former UN Under Secretary General for Special Political Affairs from 1987, Brian Urquhart. So Urquhart, talking about the problem of Palestine, this is another framing, of course, the problem of Palestine has haunted the development of the United Nations ever since 1948 and has twisted the organisation's image and fragmented its reputation and prestige as no other issue has. And maybe some of you have followed the hand-wringing over international law in the last couple of years, since October 7th. So the killing of Israelis by Hamas and a kind of cluster of militant Palestinian organisations, and then the invasion of Gaza and the genocide that's taken place over 2 years. And so maybe some of you have seen, as I say, this kind of hand-wringing about, like, where is international law? Why does it not seem to have any power in this situation? So from 1948 now to 2025, Palestine has been this constant thorn in the side of the United Nations, and has constantly put this question to international law and what it is able to do. So he goes on, he says, the failure of the UN to abide by the full range of prevailing international legal norms in its management of the question of Palestine has been demonstrative of a larger failure by the organisation to take Palestine and its people seriously. This has ultimately resulted in the organisation perpetually conceiving of them and their putative membership in the system as subordinate and contingent, thereby reifying, maintaining and perpetuating their legal subalternity over time. And he goes on. So he says, what and where is Palestine? Who and where its people? Why were they uprooted? And above all, why did they remain dispossessed and in forced exile? These are existential questions that have characterised Palestinian diasporic experience since 1948. And I just absolutely recommend that book to you if it's something, a topic that you are interested in. Okay, so let's try and say a little bit now about language in this, in relation to this event and in this kind of domain of international affairs. Now, by looking obviously at international law and looking at resolutions, then all of this is languaging. And of course, language has played a crucial role in constructing the Palestine-Israel conflict. And a crucial resolution is the 1947 UN Resolution 181, which recommends the partition of Palestine. So 1947, as I say. Now, this resolution itself has decades of history. And Victor Catan, who I mentioned as part of the research team, he published a book called From Coexistence to Conquest, the Arab-Israeli conflict from, I think it's like the 1890s up to 1947. He talks about the big historical forces that lead us to this point of Palestine being partitioned. And they are Zionism, so it looks at the history of Zionism, colonialism, of course, because this is absolutely a colonial project, and of course anti-Semitism. So, you know, it's all of these big factors coming together at the same time that are behind the international political power that goes forward with this recommendation for the partition of Palestine. Okay, so we now have a corpus of these resolutions around Palestine and Israel, and a group of us have just published a paper setting out the corpus. So this is what it looks like. We've got the data from both the General Assembly and the Security Council. You can see they're very different sizes in terms of the number of resolutions that have been passed. But since 1947, the General Assembly has passed 671 resolutions just in its ordinary sessions. Of course, there have been special sessions and there have been emergency sessions that have passed other resolutions. And we don't yet have all of that data. So it's just the ordinary sessions of the United Nations, 671 resolutions. So it's been this huge, ongoing, unresolved conflict within the United Nations system. And framing that, of course, we know that language has a crucial role in shaping and legitimising organised violence, and that's how I ended up in this topic, having spent 20 years working on this topic, looking initially at the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So we know that language plays this crucial role. And one of the things that I think is so intriguing about the relationship between language and organised violence is that it shows us, if we didn't already know, the agency that language has, the idea that you cannot ever be outside of language. So why do I say that? Well, surely organised violence is the most embodied and physical thing that humans engage in. So shouldn't, you know, if language didn't have this power, we would be able to all agree on the meaning of the events that we now can witness on social media. We'd all have the same name for the things that are going on. And so I feel like this issue just pushes us to accept in this really comprehensive way that language is always telling us the meaning of things, and we can't access that without language. And so there's been all of this discussion and this intensive policing of the language around Israel's genocide. And so I've just got some examples up on my slide of people contesting the language to use. And I know, having studied this language, that I am constantly, everyone is constantly taking a position. There's no way around that. There's no neutral space to take here. And if you feel like you're in a neutral space, it just means you're in the dominant narrative. Now, the role of language, it's not haphazard, it's not ad hoc in the space. And I'm not going to read all the text on these two slides, but I just want to indicate the work coming out of sociology around the critical role, not simply of ideology, but ideologisation as a crucial underpinning of organised violence in the modern era, where we've developed more and more brutal and lethal technology, at the same time that we've got these really strong discourses around human rights. Okay, so Milosevic talks about this as a kind of ontological dissonance. So on the one hand, we've got these really strong, Enlightenment beliefs about human rights. At the same time, we see all of these states using this just brutal, terrible technology that is just, it's lethal. Last week in Sydney, our state hosted a really big weapons expo at Darling Harbour. So all of these deplorable people in this industry were hosted in this beautiful setting in Sydney. The police pepper sprayed protesters who turned up to protest the lethal, brutal arms industry. So language has played this crucial shaping role for generations in helping us live with organised violence as a part of our political communities. So there's a couple of quotes, if you're interested, to go and have a look from this work by Milosevic about the expanding role and power of ideologisation. Some of you might be familiar with a discussion in Firth and Halliday about, is it possible that in the 20th century language became even more powerful than it was? I think this is a really interesting idea to talk about at some stage. Okay, so that's a little bit of contextualising from international law and from sociology. Okay, so methodologically, what's going on? So we've got a big data set and we can't analyse all of it in a detailed manual way. So obviously we can use the tools of corpus linguistics to try and get some patterns out of this data set, some relevant patterns. On the other hand, we know that we've got to stay close to the kind of micro grammar of these texts to try and see what the patterns are that we should be attending to. And I have to thank Alex, who really pushed me into corpus linguistics and helped me see how these two methods could work very, very well together. Okay, so again, I'm sorry, the slide's got all this print on it, but you're looking again at Resolution 181, so the resolution that recommends the partition of Palestine, and that's passed by the General Assembly in 1947. And we can do a standard Hallidaean grammatical analysis. We can look at generic structure when we get up close to these texts. They all have a preamble and then they have an operative part. So they've got a very clear kind of reified generic structure. And they have a particular kind of grammar that distinguishes those two sections. The preamble always consists of non-finite clauses, and the operative section moves into declarative mood and present tense. So this is a prefabricated way. I haven't been able to find anything about the history of this. The United Nations just says it's an established way that diplomats understand of presenting these kinds of texts. So we can do grammatical analysis, obviously. We can do a transitivity analysis, and Alex and I are working on some of that analysis at the moment. And so taking, for example, this first UN resolution, it starts off with the General Assembly, like they all do, and then we get a long interrupting clause, which is the preamble. So having met in special session at the request of the mandatory power, which of course is Britain at this time, to constitute and instruct a special committee to prepare for the consideration of the question of the future government of Palestine. Okay, you can hear the kind of highly bureaucratised legalistic language that is a feature of all of these texts. So the preamble setting up the justification, and over time these get longer and longer because there's history gets created in the United Nations of key resolutions passed in the General Assembly, passed in the Security Council, so that preamble gets longer. And then we get to clause 13 in this particular text, where we get the first move in the operative section. So the General Assembly considers that the present situation in Palestine is one which is likely to impair the general welfare and friendly relations among nations. Now, I just want to pull this one clause out. I'm about to go on and show you some corpus findings, but I want to pull this one clause out. It's an incredibly powerful identifying clause. Okay, so it defines the present situation in Palestine. It constructs the present situation in Palestine as if that is a viable generalisation about all the many different things that were going on in Palestine at the time. It reduces those in this really kind of generalised nominal group, and then the value that is given to that token echoes Article 14 of the Charter of the UN, which is about, if the General Assembly deems something likely to impair the general welfare or friendly relations, okay? So it invokes the power of the General Assembly to go on and make a recommendation, okay? So this beautiful grammar that we know so well, the identifying clause, it is just bearing the weight of the history of what follows on after this resolution is passed. Okay, so I want to just give you a little comparison from 1947 to 2020, which is when our current data set ends. So you can see the title of this 181 resolution, Future Government of Palestine. It's 4 words. By 2020, the title is now 28 words. And this resolution that you can see on the right-hand side from 2020, a version of that has been passed now in the General Assembly every year for about 23 years, right? So it's this kind of performance where the General Assembly is getting up and essentially tabling the same resolution year in, year out, about the sovereignty of the Palestinian people and the occupied Palestinian territory, et cetera. So the texts are bigger, they're longer, they're more repetitive, they're more kind of bureaucratised by 2020. You can see the difference in the length, so 508 versus 1836. 41 clauses in the first resolution and 101 by 2020. And I mentioned that the little preamble you could see in the 1947 resolution, which constituted 27% of that text, it's now nearly 60% of the text is this preamble, just going over and over and over all these resolutions that have been passed that have not really had any significant impact on what's happening in this conflict. Okay, so we want to stay close because we can see these changes. We can see these wording contrasts. So in 1947, you get Government of Palestine. Okay, by 2020, it's permanent sovereignty. Okay, so not government, permanent sovereignty, which kind of sounds good, but it's a bit vague, right? We get the Palestinian people. I'm going to talk about the rise of the Palestinian people in this data set. And it's hard to see Palestine after 1947. It's very hard to see Palestine in this data. 2020, what have we got? The occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. So a highly fragmented space. Okay, so these two methods, it's really important to be able to bring these two methods together, looking closely into the text and then using the corpus tools to stand back and see what happens to these patterns. So this expression, Government of Palestine, we only see it in 1947 and then it just disappears, which of course is part of what the United Nations was involved in, right? So if we look at the word government now, and the diagram on the right-hand side is showing the collocates using a tool called LengthsBox. And the dominant association with government is now with Israel, it's not with Palestine. And this is part of what happens to place over this time period. Okay, so I'm going to move in now and just show you some of the findings from the corpus work. So I can see it's just about 10 o'clock. So I hope to maybe finish in the next maybe 10 minutes then and have some time for discussion. So let's have a look. Okay. So the idea to look in a systematic way at people and place came out of reading Artie Imseis's book that I mentioned earlier on, where he makes the case that the UN does not take Palestine and its people seriously. And of course, he examines that in a legal framework. But I thought, okay, we should look at this. We should try and see what these categories look like, how they're lexicalized, what happens over time to people and place. Again, just to do a little contrast between 1947 and 2020. So 1947, the only reference to people, as in the people of Palestine, in the 1947 resolution is the expression, the inhabitants of Palestine. Okay, so this is how they're referred to at the time. And it was very common in colonial documents. I know this from reading Victor Catan's book. They were commonly referred to as the inhabitants of Palestine. And they're only referenced in the 1947 resolution when the UN General Assembly calls on them to be part of taking the plan to partition Palestine forward. So it's the only time they're invoked in this resolution is to recruit them to be part of setting up whatever's necessary to actually partition Palestine. Okay, when we jump forward to 2020, you can see there's a reference to the Palestinian people in 2020. So let's look at what happens over time. So the graph that I've got on my page was done with this really neat tool that's been developed by the Informatics Hub at Sydney University together with the Australian Text Analytics platform. And if you contact the Sydney Corpus Lab, they would give you access to it if it's a tool that you're interested in using. Okay, so this data is diachronic, and so clearly we're interested in how things change over time. And so I've searched inhabitants of Palestine, so you can see it's a little blip before 1950, and then inhabitants of Palestine disappears. We get other inhabitants, okay? So that term doesn't entirely disappear because we start to get displaced inhabitants is the term, but inhabitants of Palestine disappears. And then you can see there's nothing up until 1970 where we start to get terms like people of Palestine, Palestinians, Palestinian people. I've deliberately left out what's going on there to kind of dramatise what's filling that space, right? So for 2 decades, there's no use of the word people in these UN resolutions. It's really kind of unbelievable, right? That the notion of people does not appear in these resolutions. So let me fill that gap in for you. So the gap is filled by the term refugees. Okay, so by 1949, I think is the first resolution, we get a concept of Palestine refugees introduced in the data set. And then for the next 2 decades, these resolutions are just about refugees, as if there's no other concept or way of referring to the people of Palestine, Palestinian people, Palestinian citizens. You don't see any of that in this data. They are only refugees. Now, why does that matter? Well, let me take you back to Adi Imsis's book. So he says in the 20 years following the Nakba, Palestine is treated merely as a refugee problem. It's a humanitarian problem. It's not a problem of people robbed of their sovereignty or people dispossessed. It becomes a refugee problem, and the data shows that really, really clearly. And just to give you a quantification, if we take these different categories, and these are the dominant categories of people in this data, refugees is overwhelmingly the dominant category at 43%. People which enters, you can see as the 70s get going, people come into this data, 41%. We get a little slice of inhabitants. We get a little slice of Palestinians. And then 9% what I've called Palestinian X, which is like Palestinian families, Palestinian women and children, Palestinian journalists. So these categories of people that are denoted as Palestinian, there's a little slice as well over this time period. We never get the concept of a Palestinian citizen or Palestinian citizens, even though there were Palestinian citizens. Palestinians had citizenship at the time of the 1947 resolution. And we can see this erasure. I went to look at the British Hansard, right? So the British were the mandatory power at the time. The British were one of the key forces behind the 1947 resolution. So if we look at what happens in the British Hansard data, I've searched for Palestinian citizenship, and we can see in the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 1940s, these were terms in the British Hansard, and then nothing in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, that just completely evaporates. And then it starts to minimally return in the 90s and the 2000s. Okay, so two dominant categories, refugees and people. We can see they've got a different kind of diachronic appearance in the data. And so refugees is a constant term in this data set from 1947. With people arriving in the 70s, as I said. One of the other interesting things that we need to do some more exploration of is the separation of people and refugees. So across this data set, there's a little bit of overlap of text where both terms appear, people and refugees, but they're largely kept separated in the data. So refugees are a category over here, and people are a category over here. They have different kinds of collocation, so they're doing different kinds of legal, political, ideological work in the data. Okay, so let's have a little look at the concept of refugees in this data set. Now, you might think that Palestine refugee and Palestinian refugee would mean the same thing. I did before I started really looking into this data, only to discover that they absolutely don't mean the same thing. So a Palestine refugee has a very circumscribed definition in international law. They're the only category of refugees excluded from the UN Refugee Convention. So the main international convention about refugees excludes Palestine refugees. So they have their own particular definition. You have to have been a person whose normal place of residence was Palestine from this period to this period, who lost both home and means of livelihood. Okay, so the category of Palestinian refugee is open and quite large. A Palestine refugee is bureaucratically bounded by the United Nations. And I'd also note that the definition extends only to male children of people who fit this definition. So as I say, Palestine refugee is not the same thing as a Palestinian refugee. Okay, so refugees is the dominant category, and most of the time they're constructed as Palestine refugees. And in 50% of the usages of Palestine refugees, that feels like it's at least a category of people in the data, is in fact just a reference to a bureaucratic agency. So it's the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. So this big category of people, 50% of the time, is just a bureaucratic agency. And when we look at the collocation, the term refugees is only minimally associated with the idea of rights. We're going to see when we look at people that the people is a political category. So it is associated with ideas about sovereignty, self-determination rights, whereas refugees is a largely depoliticised category. It's about services, it's about protection. So this is Imsis's point, right? When you reduce this political crisis to a humanitarian crisis, you effectively depoliticise it. Okay, so the category refugees is very depoliticised, minimally associated with rights, and I've just got the screenshot for you of all the concordance lines. We can see there is a little association between refugees and the right of return, but this is all of the concordance lines. So it's 18 instances across 16 texts over this nearly 8 decades of data where there's an association between refugees and a right of return. Okay, there's a little bit of an association with the term repatriation. Okay, so again, you can think, well, okay, the UN is trying to invest this category with some sense that refugees have a right to something. Here's what the term repatriation looks like as we look across the data set. So right back to the late 1940s, there's some discussion happening about repatriation after this ethnic cleansing that's gone on. And then there's a little blip in the early 60s, and then it just becomes this mantra in the UN, where it turns up in an annual resolution or a couple of annual resolutions, the same thing repeated over and over, as if almost to raise the white flag. So the word's mentioned, but it just goes nowhere. And when it is invoked, it's constantly invoked in relation to alternative potential solutions. So repatriation or compensation, repatriation or resettlement. So there's no really strong commitment in the United Nations to the repatriation of Palestinians across this long time period. Okay, so to say a couple of things about the word people. So I mentioned before, these are two distinct categories, refugees and people. We can see it diachronically, and we can see in terms of the different collocations around them. So people definitely has a stronger sense of a political category that we associate with the people. So it's associated with sovereignty, self-determination, representation, so these kinds of terms. So that means that absence over 20 years of people is also an absence of the collocations that go with this category. And yes, we see this association with rights, but for most of the time, it's really these generic rights, you know, inalienable human rights of the Palestinian people. When, you know, we can just see that's not what's happening, right? The right to sovereignty, self-determination, again, these are supposedly human rights that they're entitled to, which clearly they have not been entitled to. And there's a little bit of a few instances here and there of more specific rights, like the right of return, but there's not much in the data that is setting up specific rights. IMSOS also suggests that in the way that the UN is kind of got this mantra about the human rights of the Palestinians, it never really condemns the illegality of Israel's occupation. And I've put all the examples on the slide. So every single example across this 73 years of when the UN talks about the illegal Israeli occupation. So it's only in 6 texts out of 671. Okay, more to say there, but I just want to say a little bit about place just in the next couple of minutes, and then I'll wind up. Okay, and there's more to say here. So all I'm going to talk about is the lexical item Palestine, but there's more work we need to do here. Okay, so Palestine, we see it in that first resolution, and you can see in my little diagram here that the term Palestine just rises in frequency over time. But in fact, it predominantly turns up as classifier. So if I want to summarise what the findings are, it's not Palestine as place, it's Palestine as, well, it's an adjective, right? It's a classifier of Palestine refugees, Palestine Liberation Organisation, or it's a post-modifier, so problem of Palestine, question of Palestine, and both of those being terms that construct Palestine as contingent, as questionable, as a problem needing a solution. Okay, so it's undermining a sense of Palestine. So its dominant grammatical environments are not about Palestine itself as a place. In that early resolution, we already start to see that, right? It's predominantly a post-modifier here. And by 2020, how do we see it? Well, it's finally coming out as a political entity, a geopolitical entity. So the preambles talks about taking note of the accession by Palestine to several human rights treaties. Okay, and the potential to do that arrives in this data in 1998. I'll explain that in a minute. But it's largely confined to the role of classifier, as in Palestine refugee, or as a post-modifier, right? So it's been grammatically decentered. It's been taken out of the thing and head role, which would give it the most visibility as the name of a political place and entity. So it emerges in a 1998 resolution, which is passed because the PLO concedes to the 1947 resolution. Okay, so the PLO agree to accept the partition resolution, and in exchange, they're allowed to call themselves Palestine in the United Nations, which, you know, it just seems so astonishing. So finally, we get this little emergence of Palestine, but it's an absolutely minimal category in the data. Okay, so by 2020, in this resolution, so yes, we've got some kind of sense of Palestine, but you can see in this really wordy title that it shows this fragmentation. So it's not really Palestine, it's the permanent sovereignty of the Palestinian people. I mean, what a joke. And it's their sovereignty within this highly circumscribed and fragmented territory. And so I just leave you with that comment that I mentioned earlier from Artie Imsice. I feel like this analysis is really bringing out this failure to take Palestine and its people seriously. Thanks very much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Annabelle, for such a wonderful presentation. Yeah, and you did very well. We had 10 minutes for Q&A, so that's wonderful.
Thank you
so much. Yeah, and we have 31 people on Zoom now, so fantastic. So everyone, so question time, we have 10 minutes to interact with Annabelle on the topic. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask question directly. Or if you are unable to do so, please type your question in the chat and Annabelle and I will have a look at the chat. Susie, yep. Please, Susie.
Hi, Annabelle. Thanks. Such interesting work and such a huge data set. I have 3 things to say, so I'll say all 3. You can answer them now, later, or never. So one is a kind of bigger picture thing, which is it strikes me that most of the UN are colonizers themselves. You know, the chief members and everyone in the UN is living like we are in Australia on stolen land anyway. So I wonder how, you know, that ideologically kind of fits. Like if the UN were made up primarily of people who were not the colonizers, whether this would be different is one thing. The second thing I want to say is I'm wondering whether some of those nominal groups where Palestine is, where you've called it qualifier, is whether it's actually a facet, orientation, whatever word you want to use for that pre-nominal group thing in a nominal group, like a snippet of information, a piece of paper. You know, I don't, maybe the words like the problem of Palestine are too big to be a facet, but I wonder whether that would change things. That's the second thing. And the third thing is when you mentioned agency, I was really hoping you'd look more at agency. I mean, you can't give any, people don't have agency when they've been abstracted into a classifier or a qualifier. This is true. But I love that work you did in that paper years ago about grammar, the first covert operation of war or whatever it is, where you looked at all the different functions of the way sort of disempowering happens, or the way, you know, things get abstracted away from the truth, which I guess is kind of what you're getting at here. These are just methods of language abstracting away from the truth of what is actually happening on the ground, and kind of slight language sleight of hand to obfuscate the truth. Anyway, that's my comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much for all of those comments. On that first one, Shushi, you know, I mentioned Victor Katan's book where he talks about colonisation, Zionism and anti-Semitism being prime movers in the creation of Israel. And you think, how could anti-Semitism have been in that mix? And so, of course, he says, well, there's all these European countries, and instead of embracing the refugees from the Holocaust, instead of acknowledging their own anti-Semitism as part of that history, they just want to export that problem overseas. And, you know, it's, I guess I shouldn't be shocked at my age after everything I've seen, but reading that history, I was still just so shocked that that was just done so, it was done so blatantly. And so the project of Zionism just worked in the favour of so many powerful European anti-Semites that it's just this kind of heady mix that comes together, and it's distressing. And you know, there were some people who, plenty of Jewish people, of course, arguing against the Zionist project at the time. And so there's just so much going on. But your summary of the UN being led by colonisers, I think it says it very accurately. I love the fact that you went from that question to a grammar question. And I've puzzled over exactly that question. And so I need to kind of make that a bit more explicit, because I think that's a really important point. And I think most of those categories I'm happy with, but I love this aspect of the grammar, and I think it's really important. And the third one is really the work that I'm reporting today. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit, I reckon, in terms of what's going on in the data. So there's just a lot more work to do here to really get into some of those deeper microgrammatical patterns. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Susie, for the question, and Annabelle for the answers. Please feel free to raise your hands, everyone, or unmute yourself to ask question directly. Lucy, a comment in the chat, lot of visualization of the analysis. Thank you. That's lovely. Any further question, everyone?
Well, if no one's going to continue, I will.
Okay, and you continue, Susie, and then Catherine.
No. So let someone else go first. I'll go last.
Okay, that's fine. Catherine, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Annabelle. This was really an interesting talk. And I just had a curiosity. You mentioned somewhere along the way that you were thanking someone else for drawing you to corpus studies. And so I just wondered actually if you could say a little bit more about that. What did you prefer before getting into the corpus, and what drew you this time?
Thanks for that question, Catherine. So Alexandra Garcia, who's here online, was my former PhD student. And so she really brought these methods to her PhD, and that was all new to me. And so she pushed me along in that direction, and I went off and kind of did my own training. And so she and I have continued to collaborate in this space, looking at the intersection of these methods. And I feel like it's really important on our side in SFL. You know, we're really good at microtext analysis, but doing that, you know, you've got a really tiny set of texts. So you lack any kind of generalizability. From the corpus linguistics side, you know, it's really methods driven, and it's not very theoretical. And I'm thinking about the work of, you know, if we take, say, the Lancaster corpus linguists who have really given a lot of international visibility to linguistics and corpus linguistics. They're really good corpus linguists, but they don't have a lot of linguistic theory. They dabble a little bit in CDA, and I kind of think CDA doesn't really get the power of language, and they also try and incorporate some work from sociology. So thinking, for example, and history actually. So there've been some really interesting books in the last few years where they're trying to get a handle on that cultural context that their data sits in, but they need to do it better. So, you know, there's more work. The big problems that we need to work on, we need a range of methods, we need robust linguistic theory, and we need good contacts in the disciplines that are also looking at these problems from their disciplinary point of view. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Catherine. And next, Susie or Susie.
Hi again, Annabelle and everybody. I just want to say something also about Zionism. I mean, if you look at the Old Testament, which I do because I go intermittently to the synagogue and I grew up in a, you know, fairly sort of Jewish tradition, I think what one is never told really, and it's only in this kind of more modern period, is that the whole Zionist project is a colonial project. The Jews do not start in Israel. They start over where? In the land of Ur with Abraham. And we are always told about the promised land, and no one ever does a critical analysis of what a promised land is. It means it's not yours. It means it's someone else's. And it certainly wasn't a terra nullius, you know, an empty land.
Yeah.
But one rabbi once said to me that the Torah is very clear about the fact that the Jews need to coexist with whoever they find in the land when they get there. And if you read the Old Testament, the Jews basically fight their way across the Middle East to get to the land of Canaan, fighting with lots of different groups along the way because different groups along the way won't let them pass. So it's a pretty warmongering text, the Old Testament. And then this rabbi also said, not only do the Jews have to coexist with whoever they find when they get there, but if they don't comport themselves with decency and integrity, they don't deserve to be there. But you don't hear that. I mean, you do hear that in some of the more progressive Jewish circles, which I think Aoni Etewe is going to speak in the middle of the day about today. There are Jewish circles that really, you know, resist that. But I mean, Jews are, you know, pretty powerful mob, really, aren't they? And in a sense, are the colonizers as well. It's a complex space. I tell you what, it's such a complex space. Anyway, that was just another comment.
Thanks so much, Shushi. I'm also looking forward to Orni's presentation today too.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Susie and Annabelle. You can stop the screen share so people can see you more clearly in the Q&A. Okay.
I can't even work out where I
Okay,
am.
excellent.
Did
Yeah.
that work?
Yeah, it's worked. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Thanks, Susie, for the comment. Any further comments and questions, everyone? We had 3 more minutes. So I think that's enough for one final question or even 2 if you have smaller questions or comments to add. If there are any further questions, that's totally fine. We can have a break for this morning, and then we will join the breakout room. There are 2 breakout room after the morning tea, everyone. But first of all, let's thank Professor Annabelle Lukin from Macquarie University again for her wonderful presentation.
Thanks so much.
And
Thanks for
so
coming
much.
along today.
Thanks so much, everyone, for turning up at the early time. We got a really good number, 34. That's fantastic. And please feel free to stay on Zoom for 50 minutes. You can go grab a cup of water or coffee, and we'll be back at 10:45 for the breakout room. So I'm going to do the breakout room now, and you can join the breakout room now if you like. Thanks again,
Thank you.
everyone, and see you in the breakout room. Thanks again, Annabelle.